Millionaire finds a child stealing from his refrigerator, but upon recognizing his birthmark, Richard Parker, the textile industry magnate, crossed the threshold of his mansion with weary steps. The echo of his Italian shoes resonated on the marble of the foyer, reminding him once again of the loneliness that had enveloped him for 5 years, since the tragedy that took his wife Emily and his son Tommy in that fateful accident. "Good evening, Mr. Parker," greeted Roger, the head of security, with a discreet bow. Richard barely responded with an absent gesture. His thoughts wandered between the figures from the last board meeting and the emptiness he felt in his chest every time he returned home. He loosened his tie as he headed to the kitchen, looking for something that could appease the hunger he hadn't noticed during the day. That's when he saw him, a skinny boy about 10 years old with messy hair and worn clothes rummaging through his refrigerator. For an instant, time seemed to stand still. The child's eyes, large and frightened, locked onto Richard's. "Hey, you!" exclaimed Richard, more out of surprise than anger. The boy, like a cornered animal, slammed the refrigerator door shut and ran towards the service exit, taking with him a piece of cheese and an apple. Richard, still stunned, took a few seconds to react. "Roger, there's an intruder in the kitchen," he shouted as he ran after the little thief. The security guard appeared as if by magic, intercepting the boy just as he was about to jump the garden fence. He held him firmly, but without hurting him. "Let me go. I haven't done anything wrong," the boy shouted, kicking in the air. Richard approached, panting from the unexpected run. As he saw the boy up close, something in his gaze shook him. It wasn't fear he saw in those dark eyes, it was desperation. "Wait, Roger," said Richard, raising a hand. "Don't call the police yet." He crouched down to be at eye level with the boy, who was now trembling slightly. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he had expected. The boy hesitated for a moment, looking alternately at Richard and Roger. "Matt," he finally responded, his voice barely a whisper. "All right, Matt," Richard continued. "Why were you stealing food from my house?" Matt lowered his gaze, ashamed. "I was hungry," he mumbled. "I haven't eaten anything in 3 days." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The idea of a child going hungry on the streets, while he lived surrounded by luxury, suddenly seemed obscene to him. "Roger, let him go," he ordered. The guard obeyed, though with evident reluctance. "But sir, this child has entered your property illegally," Roger protested. "I know," Richard responded without taking his eyes off Matt. "But I think we can make an exception this time." He turned to the boy, who was now looking at him with a mixture of confusion and hope. "Matt, do you have somewhere to spend the night?" The boy shook his head. Richard made a decision in that instant, a decision that would change the course of his life forever. "Then you'll stay here tonight," he said, surprising himself. "Tomorrow we'll see what we can do to help you." Matt's eyes widened, unable to believe what he was hearing. Are you serious?" he asked with a trembling voice. Richard nodded, flashing the first genuine smile in a long time. "Come on. You must be starving. Let's prepare something for dinner." As they walked back to the house, Richard couldn't stop thinking about how strange the situation was. For the first time in years, he felt that something had changed in his routine, in his life. He couldn't explain it, but somehow the presence of this unknown child had awakened something in him that he thought was lost forever. That night, as Matt slept in one of the guest rooms, Richard stayed awake, contemplating an old photograph of his family. For a moment, he thought he saw a glimmer of hope in the eyes of his own reflection. The next morning, Richard woke up with a strange sensation, as if he had had a vivid dream but couldn't remember it. It took him a few seconds to recall the events of the previous night. Had he really taken in a street child into his home? The idea now seemed as absurd as it was reckless. He dressed quickly and went downstairs, almost expecting to find the house empty, convinced that it had all been a product of his imagination. However, as he entered the kitchen, he was confronted with a scene that left him paralyzed. Matt was sitting at the table, devouring a plate of scrambled eggs that Martha, the housekeeper, had prepared for him. The woman was watching him with a mixture of tenderness and concern, as if she wasn't quite sure what to do with this unexpected guest. "Good morning, Mr. Parker," Martha greeted, visibly nervous. "I hope you don't mind that I gave the boy some breakfast." Richard shook his head, still processing the scene. No, you did well, Martha. Thank you." He approached the table and sat across from Matt, who looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "Good morning, Matt. Did you sleep well?" The boy nodded, quickly swallowing the mouthful he had in his mouth. "Yes, sir. Thank you for letting me stay." Richard noticed that the boy seemed more relaxed than the night before, although he still maintained a certain tension in his shoulders, as if he were ready to run at any moment. "Matt," Richard began, carefully choosing his words, "I need you to tell me a bit more about yourself. Where do you come from? Where is your family?" The boy's expression immediately darkened. He put down his fork on the plate and lowered his gaze. "I don't have a family," he mumbled. "Well, I had a grandmother, but she died a few months ago. Since then, I've been on the streets." Richard felt a pang of pain in his chest. Matt's story reminded him too much of his own loss. "And your parents?" he insisted, although he feared the answer. Matt shrugged. "I never knew them. My grandmother said that my mum was very young when she had me and that my dad left before I was born." The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with unexpressed emotions. Richard found himself fighting against the urge to hug the boy, to promise him that everything would be all right. But how could he make such a promise? "Listen, Matt," he said finally, "I can't let you go back to the streets. It's dangerous and, well, it's not right. But I can't simply adopt you or something like that either. We need to find an adequate solution." Matt's eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and distrust. "You mean I can stay longer?" Richard nodded, surprising himself for the second time in less than 24 hours. "Yes, at least for now. But we'll have to establish some rules and, well, we'll have to see what options there are for your future." At that moment, Roger entered the kitchen, interrupting the conversation. "Mr. Parker, excuse the interruption, but you have an urgent call from the office." Richard sighed. The outside world kept turning, oblivious to the small revolution that was happening in his life. "Thank you, Roger. I'll be right there." He turned to Matt. "I have to take this. Why don't you ask Martha to show you around the house? We'll talk more later." As he headed to his office, Richard couldn't stop thinking about how surreal the situation was. Just a few hours ago, his life was a monotonous routine of work and loneliness. Now, suddenly, he had a street child living under his roof. What was he getting himself into? The call from the office turned out to be about a crisis in one of his factories. As Richard listened to the details, his mind wandered to Matt. What was he going to do with him? He couldn't simply return him to the streets, but he wasn't prepared to be a father figure either. The memory of Tommy, his deceased son, crept into his thoughts, causing a pang of pain. After hanging up, Richard sat in his chair for a moment, contemplating a photograph of Emily and Tommy on his desk. What would they think of this situation? Would they approve of his decision to help Matt? A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, straightening in his seat. To his surprise, it was Matt who timidly entered the office. "Excuse me, Mr. Parker," said the boy, clearly nervous. "Martha told me I could explore the house, but I think I got lost." Richard couldn't help but smile at the boy's confusion. "Don't worry, Matt. This house can be a maze at first. Come, sit down." He indicated an armchair in front of his desk. Matt obeyed, looking in awe at the luxurious furniture and the paintings adorning the walls. "Your house is very beautiful," the boy commented. "I've never seen anything like it." The innocence and admiration in Matt's voice moved Richard. For a moment he saw himself through the boy's eyes, a rich and powerful man, living in a palace of loneliness. "Thank you, Matt. But you know what? Sometimes I think it's too big for just one person." The boy looked at him curiously. "Don't you have a family, Mr. Parker?" The question, so direct and sincere, hit Richard like a hammer. He felt a lump forming in his throat. "I had," he finally responded, his voice breaking. "But I lost them a long time ago." Matt was silent for a moment, as if processing the information. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I've lost my family too. It's very sad, isn't it?" Richard nodded, unable to speak. For the first time in years, he felt that someone truly understood his pain. "Matt," he said after a long silence, "would you like to stay here for a while? At least until we find a better solution for you." The boy's eyes lit up. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" Richard shook his head, feeling a small spark of life ignite in his heart. "No, I wouldn't mind. In fact, I think I could use some company." Matt smiled, a genuine smile that lit up the entire room. "Thank you, Mr. Parker. I promise I'll behave and won't give you any trouble." Richard stood up and walked around the desk, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm sure you will, Matt. And please call me Richard." As they left the office together, Richard felt that something had changed inside him. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. What neither of them knew at that moment was that this was just the beginning of a journey that would transform them both, challenging their perceptions of the world and themselves, and weaving a bond that not even they could imagine. The following days were a whirlwind of activity in the Parker mansion. Richard, accustomed to his solitary routine, suddenly found himself immersed in a world of decisions and preparations he never imagined he would face again. The first order of business was buying new clothes for Matt. The boy, used to wearing worn and second-hand garments, was awestruck when Richard took him to an exclusive store in the mall. "Is all of this for me?" Matt asked, his eyes shining with excitement as he walked through aisles filled with colorful clothes and gleaming shoes. Richard nodded, feeling a mix of satisfaction and guilt. How long had this child gone without having something new? "Choose whatever you want, Matt. You need a complete wardrobe." As the boy tried on different outfits, Richard couldn't help but think of the times he had done this same thing with Tommy. Nostalgia and pain mixed with a new sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. As they left the store laden with bags, Richard noticed Matt was walking strangely, as if his feet hurt. "Are you okay, Matt?" he asked, concerned. The boy nodded, but Richard could see he was lying. "It's the new shoes, isn't it? They're hurting you." Matt lowered his gaze, embarrassed. "A little. It's just that I'm not used to wearing shoes all the time." Richard felt his heart constrict. How long had this child gone without proper footwear? "Don't worry," he said, trying to sound cheerful. "New shoes always bother at first. You'll see how you get used to them." Back at the mansion, Richard found himself facing another challenge: Matt's education. It turned out the boy could barely read and write, and his math skills were practically non-existent. "We need to find you a tutor," Richard decided one afternoon, after spending a frustrating hour trying to explain to Matt how to add fractions. "Someone who can help you catch up with your studies." Matt seemed to shrink in his seat. Is it necessary?" he asked with a trembling voice. I'm not very good at school." Richard knelt beside him, looking him in the eyes. "Matt, you're a smart kid. You just need the opportunity to learn, and I'm going to make sure you have that opportunity." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing all this for me, Richard? Nobody has ever been so kind to me before." Richard felt a lump in his throat. How could he explain to this child that somehow he was giving a new purpose to his life? "Because I believe you deserve a chance, Matt. And because you remind me that there's still kindness in the world." That night, after putting Matt to bed, Richard stayed up late, reviewing old photo albums. He paused on an image of Tommy, smiling and carefree on his 10th birthday, the same age Matt was now. "What am I doing, Emily?" he murmured, caressing the photograph of his wife. "Am I trying to replace our son?" There was no answer, of course, just the silence of the night and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Days turned into weeks, and slowly Matt began to flourish under Richard's care. The tutor they hired, a patient and kind woman named Sophie, managed to awaken in the boy an interest in learning that he had never experienced before. "Richard, look!" Matt exclaimed one afternoon, running towards him with a notebook in his hand. "I got an A on my math test." Richard felt a wave of pride that took him by surprise. "That's wonderful, Matt. I'm very proud of you." The words left his mouth before he could think about them, and for a moment they both froze. It was the first time Richard had openly expressed his pride in Matt. The boy, with eyes bright with emotion, threw himself into Richard's arms, hugging him tightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for believing in me." Richard returned the hug, feeling something thaw inside him. Maybe, he thought, this is what healing feels like. But not everything was rosy. As Matt adapted to his new life, uncomfortable questions began to arise. One night, while they were having dinner, Matt dropped a bombshell. "Richard, and what's going to happen to me when you don't want me here anymore?" Richard almost choked on his food. "What? Matt, where did you get that idea?" The boy was nervously playing with his fork, not looking up. "It's just, this is too good to be true, and good things never last, you know. At least not for me." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. How could he make this child understand that he had no intention of abandoning him? "Matt, look at me," he said with a firm but gentle voice. "I don't know what the future holds for us, but I promise you one thing. As long as I'm here, you'll have a home. I'm not going to throw you out or abandon you. Do you understand?" Matt nodded, but Richard could see he wasn't completely convinced. And he couldn't blame him. How could he ask him to trust blindly when life had taught him otherwise? That night, while Matt slept, Richard found himself reviewing legal documents and making calls to his lawyer. If he was going to do this, if he was really going to commit to Matt, he needed to do it right. He needed to give the boy the security he deserved. But as he planned for the future, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at stake, something he couldn't yet see clearly, but that he felt would change everything. What he didn't know was that very soon, an unexpected discovery would test everything he thought he knew about Matt, about himself, and about the meaning of family. The change in Richard's life was evident to everyone who knew him. His employees noticed that he smiled more, that he arrived at the office later and left earlier. Even in board meetings, he seemed more relaxed, less obsessed with numbers, and more interested in the human impact of his decisions. One afternoon, while reviewing some reports in his home office, he heard a crash coming from the attic. Alarmed, he ran up the stairs 2 at a time, fearing Matt had hurt himself. "Matt, are you okay?" he called, opening the attic door. What he saw left him breathless. Matt was standing in the middle of a chaos of overturned boxes and objects scattered across the floor. But it wasn't the mess that had paralyzed the boy. In his trembling hands, he held a framed photograph. I'm sorry," Matt stammered, tears in his eyes. "I didn't mean to. I was just exploring and—" Richard approached slowly, feeling his heart beating hard. He recognized the photograph immediately. It was Tommy, smiling and carefree on his last birthday before the accident. "It's okay, Matt," he said, trying to stay calm. "You haven't done anything wrong." But Matt didn't seem to be listening. His eyes were fixed on the image, an expression of shock and confusion on his face. "Richard, who is this boy? He looks a lot like me." Richard felt the world stop for a moment. It was true. The similarity between Matt and Tommy was striking, something he had vaguely noticed but had never allowed himself to examine closely. That was my son, Tommy," he finally responded, his voice breaking. "He passed away 5 years ago, along with my wife Emily." Matt looked up, his eyes full of a mixture of emotions that Richard couldn't decipher. "Is that why you took me in? Because I look like him?" The question hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. Was that true? Had he seen Matt as a substitute for his lost son? "No, Matt, it's not like that," he responded. But even to his own ears, his voice sounded unsure. "I took you in because you needed help, because you're a good kid who deserved a chance." But the damage was already done. Matt carefully put down the photograph and took a few steps back. I think I need to be alone for a while," he mumbled, before running out of the attic. Richard stood there, surrounded by the memories of his past life, feeling that everything he had built over the last few months was crumbling around him. That night, dinner was a tense and silent affair. Matt barely touched his food, and Richard didn't know how to break the barrier that had suddenly risen between them. "Matt," he said finally, "I know that what you discovered today must be confusing and painful, but I want you to know that—" "It's okay, Richard," Matt interrupted him, with a maturity that surprised him. "I understand that you must miss your son very much, and if you want me to leave, I'll understand." Richard felt his heart breaking. "No, Matt, I don't want you to leave. Look, it's true that at first, maybe unconsciously, I saw in you a reminder of Tommy. But these months we've spent together, you've shown me that you're your own person, unique and valuable. You're not a replacement for anyone." Matt looked at him with teary eyes. "Do you really mean that?" "Completely," Richard responded, reaching across the table to take Matt's hand. "Oh, you're part of my life now, Matt, and if you want, I'd like it to stay that way." The boy nodded slowly, a small smile forming on his lips. "I want to stay too, Richard." That night, after putting Matt to bed, Richard stayed up late, reflecting on the day's events. He knew they had a long road ahead, that this conversation was just the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, he felt he was doing the right thing. What Richard didn't know was that fate had more surprises in store for him and Matt, surprises that would test their nascent bond and reveal secrets that neither of them was prepared to face. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a woman was looking at an old photograph with tears in her eyes. A photograph of a baby who looked a lot like Matt. The woman sighed, tucking the photo into her purse. Tomorrow, she promised herself, tomorrow she would finally have the courage to seek out Richard Parker and reveal the truth she had kept for so many years. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Richard woke up, startled by a troubling dream he couldn't remember. He got up and headed to the kitchen, surprised to find Matt already awake, sitting at the table with a notebook in front of him. "Good morning, Matt," he greeted, trying to sound cheerful. "What are you doing up so early?" The boy looked up, and Richard could see he had dark circles under his eyes as if he hadn't slept well. "I was drawing," Matt responded, pushing the notebook towards Richard. Richard took the notebook and felt his breath catch. The drawing showed two figures, a tall man in a suit and a small boy, both smiling and holding hands. Underneath, Matt had written in shaky handwriting, "My new family." "Matt, this is—" Richard couldn't finish the sentence, feeling a lump in his throat. "I know I'm not Tommy," Matt said softly, "and I know I can never replace him. But do you think we could be a kind of family? You and me?" Richard put down the notebook and walked around the table, kneeling next to Matt to hug him tightly. "We already are a family, Matt," he whispered. "Different, but a family nonetheless." The moment was interrupted by the doorbell. Richard frowned, wondering who it could be at this early hour. "Stay here," he told Matt. "I'll go see who it is." Richard opened the door and found himself face to face with a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired but determined eyes. "Mr. Parker," the woman asked, "my name is Ellen Green. I need to talk to you about Matt." Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. "What do you know about Matt?" he asked, tensing instinctively. Helen took a deep breath as if gathering courage. I'm his grandmother." The words fell like a bomb in the silent foyer. Richard stood frozen, unable to process what he had just heard. "But Matt said his grandmother had passed away," he finally managed to say. Ellen nodded, tears in her eyes. "I know, it's a long story, Mr. Parker. A story that involves your wife, Emily." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. What did Emily have to do with all this? "You'd better come in," Richard said, gesturing for Ellen to enter. He led Ellen to his office, closing the door behind them. He didn't want Matt to hear this conversation, at least not until he understood what it was all about. "Please sit down," Richard indicated, trying to maintain his composure. "And now explain to me what's going on." Ellen sat down, nervously twisting a handkerchief between her hands. "Mr. Parker, what I'm about to tell you will change many things. But first, I want you to know that my daughter Laura never intended to hurt anyone." Richard frowned, confused. "Your daughter? What does your daughter have to do with all this?" Ellen took a deep breath before continuing. "Laura was a nurse at the hospital where your wife, Emily, gave birth to your son, Tommy." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. What did Tommy's birth have to do with Matt? "The day Emily gave birth," Ellen continued, her voice trembling, "there was a mix-up in the newborn nursery. Laura was on duty that night." Richard stood up abruptly, feeling short of breath. "What are you implying?" he asked, with a mixture of disbelief and fear. Ellen looked him directly in the eyes, tears running down her cheeks. "There was an accidental baby switch, Mr. Parker. The child you and Emily raised as Tommy wasn't your biological son." The world seemed to stop around Richard. Ellen's words echoed in his head, but he couldn't make sense of them. It was impossible. It had to be a mistake. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, that can't be true. Tommy was my son. He looked like me, like Emily." "Babies can look like many people, Mr. Parker," Ellen said softly. "But DNA tests don't lie." Richard collapsed heavily into his chair. "DNA tests? What tests?" Ellen pulled an envelope from her purse and placed it on the desk. "Laura discovered the error years later. She secretly ran tests, tormented by guilt. But by then, the boys were already several years old. She didn't know what to do." Richard took the envelope with trembling hands but didn't open it. He wasn't sure he wanted to see its contents. "Are you saying that Matt—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Ellen nodded slowly. "Matt is your biological son, Mr. Parker, the son you and Emily had 12 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt the world spinning around him, that nothing made sense. All these months he had been caring for his own son without knowing it. The child he had lost in the accident, the child he had mourned for years, wasn't really his. And now? Why now? He finally managed to ask. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ellen lowered her gaze, ashamed. "Laura passed away a few months ago. Cancer. On her deathbed, she confessed everything to me and asked me to do the right thing. It took me time to gather the courage to come here." Richard got up and walked to the window, trying to process all this information. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Confusion, pain, anger, but also, surprisingly, a spark of joy. Matt, the boy who had come into his life so unexpectedly, was actually his son. "Matt doesn't know anything about this, does he?" he asked, turning to Ellen. She shook her head. "No, we never told him. We thought it was better that way." Richard nodded slowly. Now he understood the resemblance, the instant connection he had felt with Matt from the beginning. It wasn't just compassion or the memory of Tommy. It was the bond between a father and his son. "What are we going to do now?" he asked, more to himself than to Ellen. "That depends on you, Mr. Parker," she responded softly. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but Matt is a good boy. He's suffered a lot. I just want what's best for him." Richard ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "I need time," he said finally. "I need to think about how to handle this, how to tell Matt." Ellen stood up, nodding understandingly. "I understand. Here's my phone number," she said, leaving a card on the desk. "Please call me when you've made a decision, and I'm so sorry, Mr. Parker, for everything." When Ellen left, Richard remained alone in his office, staring at the closed envelope on his desk. Inside were the proofs confirming that Matt was his biological son, that the boy he had been caring for these months, whom he had come to love as his own, really was his. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope and began to read the results. Each word confirmed what Ellen had said, and with each line, Richard felt his world transforming. Outside in the kitchen, Matt waited patiently, unaware of the storm that was brewing, of the truth that would change his life forever. Richard knew he had to make a decision. How would he tell Matt the truth? How would he handle this situation without hurting the boy who had already suffered so much? And more importantly, how would he deal with his own conflicting feelings, with the pain of having lost the child he thought was his son, and the joy of having found the one who really was? As the sun rose in the sky, bathing the mansion in its golden light, Richard prepared to face the greatest challenge of his life, a challenge that would test his love, his strength, and his ability to forgive and move forward. Richard remained in his office for hours, lost in thought, trying to process the avalanche of emotions that overwhelmed him. The envelope with the DNA test results lay open on his desk, irrefutable proof of the truth he had just discovered. Outside, he could hear the muffled sounds of Matt moving around the house, oblivious to the whirlwind that was unfolding around him. How was he going to explain all this to a child who had already suffered so much? How could he change his world once again? A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Richard?" Matt's voice sounded worried. "Are you okay? You've been in there all day." Richard took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "I'm fine, Matt," he replied, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. "Come in, please. We need to talk." The door opened slowly, and Matt entered, looking at Richard with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Is something wrong?" the boy asked, sitting in front of the desk. Richard looked at Matt, really looked at him, as if for the first time. Now he could see Emily's features in his face, the shape of his eyes, the curve of his smile. How had he not noticed before? "Matt," he began, carefully choosing his words, "do you remember when you told me you didn't know your parents?" The boy nodded slowly, frowning. "Yes, my grandmother told me that my mom was very young when she had me, and that my dad left before I was born." Richard felt a lump forming in his throat. "What if I told you that's not completely true? That there's more to your story than you knew?" Matt visibly tensed, his eyes filling with confusion and a hint of fear. "What do you mean?" Richard stood up and walked around the desk, kneeling in front of Matt to be at his eye level. "Matt, what I'm going to tell you is very complicated and might be hard to understand. But I want you to know that no matter what, I'm here for you. Okay?" The boy nodded, though Richard could see the fear growing in his eyes. "This morning I received a visit from a woman named Ellen," Richard began. She's your grandmother, Matt. Your real grandmother." Matt shook his head, confused. "But my grandmother died. You know that." "I know, that's what you were told," Richard continued softly. "But the truth is more complicated. You see, many years ago when you were born there was a mistake at the hospital." Richard proceeded to explain to Matt, in the gentlest and clearest way possible, about the baby switch, about Laura and her secret, about the DNA tests. With each word, he saw Matt's world crumbling and rebuilding. "So, you're my dad?" Matt finally asked, his voice trembling. "My real dad?" Richard nodded, feeling tears stinging his eyes. "Yes, Matt. According to these tests, I'm your biological father." The silence that followed was deafening. Matt stared into space, trying to process all this information. Richard wanted to hug him, to comfort him, but he wasn't sure how the boy would react. "But what about Tommy?" Matt finally asked. "The boy in the photo?" "Tommy was another couple's child," Richard explained gently. "We raised him as our son. We loved him as such. But biologically, he wasn't ours." Matt suddenly stood up, moving away from Richard. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, with a mixture of confusion and anger in his voice. "Why are you changing everything again?" Richard felt his heart breaking at seeing the pain in Matt's eyes. "Because you deserve to know the truth, Matt. Because you're my son, and I want you to know that. Because I want to give you the place you should have always had in this family." Matt shook his head, tears running down his cheeks. "I don't understand. I need to think." Before Richard could stop him, Matt ran out of the office. Richard stood up to follow him, but stopped at the door. Maybe the boy needed a moment alone to process all of this. Richard returned to his desk and collapsed into his chair, feeling exhausted and emotionally drained. He knew this was just the beginning. They would have to deal with the legal implications with Ellen, with the past and the future. But for now, all that mattered was Matt, his son. The boy who had come into his life in the most unexpected way and who now turned out to be the deepest connection to Emily he could have imagined. Richard looked at the photograph of Emily he had on his desk. "What should I do now, my love?" he whispered. "How can I help our son get through this?" There was no answer, of course, but as he looked at Emily's smile in the photo, Richard felt a renewed determination. No matter how difficult it was, he would do everything possible to make Matt feel loved, safe, and part of this family. Because that's what they were now. A family. Different, complicated, but a family nonetheless. With a sigh, Richard stood up. It was time to find Matt. They had a long road ahead, but they would travel it together. Step by step, day by day, they would build the future they both deserved. As he left the office, Richard couldn't imagine the challenges that still awaited them. Challenges that would test their love, patience, and determination in ways he never would have expected. The days following the revelation were tense and filled with emotions. Matt had become distant, spending most of his time locked in his room. Richard respected his need for space, but he couldn't help feeling helpless in the face of his newly discovered son's pain. One afternoon, as Richard was working in his office, he heard a soft knock on the door. "Come in," he said, expecting to see Martha or Roger. To his surprise, it was Matt who entered, with red-rimmed eyes and a determined expression on his face. "I want to meet her," he said without preamble. Richard blinked, confused for a moment. "Who, Matt?" "Ellen, my grandmother," the boy replied, the word sounding strange on his lips. "I want to know more about my mum, about my family." Richard felt an irrational pang of jealousy which he immediately suppressed. Of course, Matt would want to know more about his origins. "All right," Richard said, trying to maintain a neutral tone. "I can call her and arrange a meeting if that's what you want." Matt nodded but didn't move from his spot. Can I ask you something?" he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "Of course, Matt, anything." The boy took a deep breath before speaking. "If you hadn't discovered that I'm your son, Would you have adopted me anyway? The question hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He stood up from his chair and knelt in front of Matt, looking him directly in the eyes. "Matt, listen to me carefully," he said with a firm but gentle voice. "From the moment you came into my life, I knew you were special. My son or not, I already considered you part of my family. Adoption was something I was already thinking about long before I knew the truth." Matt's eyes filled with tears. "Really?" Richard nodded, feeling his own eyes moistening. "Really?" "Matt, I know all of this is confusing and scary, but I want you to know that regardless of how you came into my life, I'm grateful that you did. You're my son, in all the ways that matter." Matt threw himself into Richard's arms, sobbing softly. Richard hugged him tightly, feeling something unravel in his chest. "I love you, Dad," Matt mumbled through tears. Richard felt his heart skip a beat. It was the first time Matt had called him Dad. "I love you too, son," he responded, his voice broken with emotion. "More than you can imagine." That moment marked a turning point in their relationship. Although there were still many questions to answer and challenges to face, Richard felt they were finally moving in the right direction. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Richard got in touch with Ellen and arranged a meeting in a nearby park, a neutral ground where Matt could feel comfortable. The day of the meeting came sooner than they expected. Richard and Matt walked together to the park, the boy nervously clutching his father's hand. Ellen was waiting for them on a bench, anxiously twisting a handkerchief between her hands. When she saw them approaching, she stood up, her eyes fixed on Matt. "Hello, Matt," she said softly with tears in her eyes. I'm your grandmother, Ellen." Matt looked at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. "Hello," he responded shyly. Ellen took a photograph from her purse and handed it to Matt with trembling hands. "This is your mother, Laura," she said. "You were her spitting image when you were a baby." Matt took the photograph, studying it intently. Richard watched as the boy's eyes scanned every detail of his biological mother's face, looking for connections, similarities. "What was she like?" Matt finally asked. Ellen smiled through her tears. "She was brave and kind. She had a contagious laugh and loved books. And she loved you, Matt. She loved you more than anything in the world." As Ellen shared stories about Laura, Richard observed the interaction in silence. He felt a mix of emotions: joy for Matt, who was finally learning about his roots, sadness for the lost time, and an irrational fear that this new bond might somehow threaten his relationship with his son. But when Matt turned to him with eyes bright with emotion and said, "Dad, did you hear that? My mum was a nurse like yours," Richard felt his fears dissipate. The meeting lasted several hours, filled with laughter, tears, and many questions. When they finally said goodbye with the promise to see each other again soon, Richard was surprised to feel a wave of gratitude towards Ellen. Despite the circumstances, she had cared for Matt for years, and now she was willing to share him. That night, as Richard tucked Matt into bed, the boy looked at him with a serious expression. "Dad, do you think Mom Emily would have loved me?" he asked. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "Oh, Matt," he said, gently stroking the boy's hair. "Emily would have adored you. You were the baby we wanted so much. And even though we couldn't raise you, I know that from wherever she is, she's watching us and smiling." Matt smiled, satisfied with the answer. "Good night, Dad," he said, closing his eyes. "Good night, son," Richard responded, kissing his forehead. As he left the room, Richard paused at the door, watching his son sleep. Life had given them an unexpected turn, but somehow he felt that everything was falling into place. However, what Richard didn't know was that fate still had a few surprises in store for them. Surprises that would test their newly formed family in ways neither of them could have anticipated. In the darkness of his office, Richard's phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "Mr. Parker, we have information about the accident that killed your wife and son. Not everything is as it seems. We'll be in touch soon." Richard stared at the screen, feeling a chill run down his spine. Just when he thought things were settling down, the past threatened to resurface and shake the foundations of his new life. Richard couldn't sleep that night. The mysterious message kept spinning in his head, awakening questions he thought he had buried long ago. What could possibly not be as it seemed in the accident? And who was behind this message? The next morning, With dark circles under his eyes and a strong cup of coffee in hand, Richard debated between sharing this information with Matt or protecting him from further complications. Finally, he decided that honesty was the best policy. He didn't want any more secrets between them. "Matt," he said during breakfast, "there's something I need to tell you." The boy looked up from his bowl of cereal, intrigued by his father's serious tone. "What is it, Dad?" Richard took a deep breath before continuing. "Last night I received a strange message. Someone claims to have information about the accident in which Emily and Tommy died." Matt dropped his spoon, splashing milk on the table. "What? What kind of information?" "I don't know for certain," Richard admitted. "The message was very vague, but I wanted you to know. I don't want to hide anything from you." Matt nodded slowly, processing the information. "What are we going to do?" Richard was surprised by the use of we. Despite everything, Matt considered himself part of this, part of the family. "For now, we wait," he responded. "But I've hired a private investigator to look into the origin of the message. I want to know who we're dealing with before we take any steps." The following days were tense. Richard found himself constantly checking his phone, waiting for another message, while trying to maintain normalcy at home and at work. Matt, for his part, had become quieter, as if he were constantly lost in thought. A week after the initial message, the private investigator, a man named Jack Wilson, showed up at the Parker mansion with a preliminary report. "Mr. Parker," Jack said, sitting in Richard's office, "we've managed to trace the origin of the message. It was sent from a burner phone, but we've identified the buyer. It's a former employee of your company, Robert Miller." Richard frowned, trying to remember. "Robert Miller? The name sounds familiar, but I can't place him." Jack nodded, pulling a photograph from his briefcase. "He worked in the accounting department about 6 years ago. He was fired for irregularities in the accounts." Richard took the photograph, studying the man's face. Suddenly, a memory hit him. "Wait, I remember now. Miller. He claimed to have discovered some suspicious transactions in the company. But when we asked for proof, he couldn't provide anything concrete. We ended up firing him for spreading unfounded rumors." Jack leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Parker, there's something else you should know. We've been investigating Miller's past and, well, it seems he had connections with some rather radical activist groups that oppose the corporate practices of companies like yours." Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. "Are you suggesting that—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Parker," Jack quickly interrupted. "I'm just presenting the facts. But given the circumstances, I think we should consider the possibility that the accident involving your wife and son might not have been an accident." The world seemed to stop around Richard. The idea that Emily and Tommy's death could have been more than a terrible tragedy was too much to process. I need a moment," he mumbled, getting up and walking to the window. As he looked out at the garden, where Matt was playing with his soccer ball, Richard felt the weight of the world falling on his shoulders. How could he protect his newly discovered son if he couldn't even trust what he thought he knew about his past? A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Matt. "Dad, is everything okay?" the boy asked, looking curiously at Jack. Richard looked at his son, then at Jack, and made a decision. "Matt, come here," he said, extending his hand. "There's something we need to discuss as a family." As Matt approached, Richard prepared for a conversation that would change their lives forever. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he was determined to face it together with his son. What neither of them knew was that, at that very moment, Robert Miller was watching them from a car parked in front of the mansion, with a determined expression on his face. The past was about to collide with the present, and the consequences would be unpredictable. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries. Richard, with Jack's help, immersed himself in an exhaustive investigation of the accident that had changed his life 5 years ago. Each new piece of information seemed to open more questions than answers. Matt, for his part, oscillated between curiosity and fear. The idea that the tragedy that had marked his biological father's life might have been more than an accident filled him with a mix of emotions he could barely comprehend. One afternoon, while Richard was reviewing some documents in his office, Matt timidly entered. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Richard looked up, noticing the seriousness on his son's face. Of course, Matt. What is it? The boy hesitated for a moment before speaking. If you discover that what happened to Mom, Emily, and Tommy wasn't an accident, what are you going to do? The question hit Richard hard. It was something he had been thinking about, but hearing it from his son's lips made it even more real. I don't know for sure, Matt, he answered honestly. But I promise you one thing. Any decision I make, I'll make thinking of us, of our family. Matt nodded, but Richard could see that something else was worrying him. What else is on your mind, son? It's just... Matt hesitated. What if the people responsible come after us now? Are we in danger? Richard felt his heart constrict. He hadn't wanted to frighten Matt with his concerns, but it was clear that the boy was more perceptive than he had imagined. Listen, Matt, he said, standing up to kneel in front of his son. I'm not going to lie to you. I don't know exactly what we're facing, but I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to keep us safe. We've increased security at the house and we're being very careful. You don't have to be afraid. Matt hugged Richard tightly. I love you, Dad. I love you too, son, Richard responded, feeling that, despite everything, he had the most important thing right there in his arms. That night, while Matt slept, Richard received a call from Jack. Mr. Parker, I think we've found something, the investigator said urgently. We need to meet immediately. Half an hour later, Richard found himself in a discreet cafe in the city center. Jack arrived shortly after, with a thick folder under his arm. What have you discovered, Jack? Richard asked, barely containing his anxiety. Jack opened the folder and pulled out several photographs and documents. We've been investigating Robert Miller's activities in the months leading up to the accident, he began, and we found something disturbing. Richard leaned over the table, examining the images. They were surveillance photographs showing Miller meeting with several suspicious-looking men. Who are these people? Richard asked. They're members of a radical activist group called Corporate Justice, Jack explained. They specialize in sabotage and attacks against large companies they consider corrupt or harmful to the environment. Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. Are you saying this group could have been behind Emily and Tommy's accident? Jack nodded gravely. It's a possibility we can't rule out. But there's more, Mr. Parker. The investigator pulled out another document, a financial report. We've discovered suspicious transfers of large sums of money to an offshore account linked to Miller right after the accident. Richard felt short of breath. Are you implying that someone paid Miller to kill my family? It's a theory, Jack said cautiously. But we need more evidence before we can confirm anything. Richard ran a hand over his face, feeling the world spinning around him. What should we do now? I think it's time to confront Miller directly, Jack suggested. We have enough information to pressure him. Maybe we can make him confess. Richard nodded slowly, feeling a mix of fear and determination. Let's do it. But I want to be present when you question him. Jack seemed to hesitate. Mr. Parker, I don't think that's wise. It's not a request, Jack, Richard interrupted firmly. I need to look him in the eye. I need to know the truth. Reluctantly, Jack agreed. They arranged to meet the next day to plan the encounter with Miller. When Richard returned home, he found Matt awake, waiting for him in the living room. Dad, where were you? The boy asked, concern in his voice. Richard sat down next to his son, debating between protecting him from the truth or being honest. Matt, he began, carefully choosing his words. I was meeting with Mr. Wilson. We've discovered some things about Emily and Tommy's accident. Matt's eyes widened. What things? Was it really an accident? Richard took a deep breath. We're not sure yet, but there's evidence suggesting that it might not have been an accident. Matt was silent for a moment, processing the information. Are you going to look for those responsible? He finally asked. Richard nodded. Yes, we're going to try, but Matt, I want you to know that no matter what happens, your safety is my #1 priority. Matt hugged his father tightly. Be careful, Dad. I don't want to lose you too. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. You're not going to lose me, I promise. We're in this together, remember? That night, while Matt slept, Richard stayed awake, going over everything they had discovered. The idea that someone had deliberately orchestrated Emily and Tommy's death filled him with a rage he could barely contain. But at the same time, Matt's concern echoed in his mind. Was it worth risking his new family to seek revenge? Or should he leave the past behind and focus on the future with his son? As dawn approached, Richard made a decision. He would seek the truth, but not for revenge, but for justice. For Emily, for Tommy, and above all, for Matt. Because his son deserved to know the truth about his family, about his history. What Richard didn't know was that his actions were about to trigger a series of events that would test not only his determination, but also the bonds of his newly formed family. Meanwhile, somewhere in the city, Robert Miller stared fixedly at an old photograph of Richard Parker and his family. With trembling hands, he dialed a number on his phone. "They know," he said quietly. "Parker is investigating. We have to act now." Fate was about to intertwine its threads once again, leading Richard and Matt towards an outcome that neither of them could have imagined. The tension was palpable in the air as Richard and Jack waited in a discreet cafe on the outskirts of the city. They had agreed to meet Robert Miller here, away from prying eyes and potential interference. Richard nervously drummed his fingers on the table, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Part of him wanted to confront Miller, demand answers, maybe even seek revenge. But another part, the part that thought of Matt, reminded him that he needed to stay calm, to seek the truth without endangering what he had built. "There he is," Jack murmured, leaning slightly towards Richard. Robert Miller entered the cafe, his nervous gaze scanning the place until it landed on Richard. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, as if considering turning around and fleeing. But finally, with slow and cautious steps, he approached the table. "Mr. Parker," he greeted, his voice barely a whisper. "Elia, it's been a long time." Richard stared at him intently, searching in that familiar face for some indication of the truth he had been pursuing. "Sit down, Robert," he said, his voice cold and controlled. "We have a lot to talk about." Miller sat down, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "I suppose you've discovered things," he began, looking alternately at Richard and Jack. "We know about your connections with corporate justice," Jack said bluntly, "and about the money transfers after the accident." Miller visibly paled. "It's not what you think," he said quickly. I had nothing to do with the accident, I swear." Richard leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Miller. "Then explain it to us, Robert, because from where I'm sitting it looks like you orchestrated the death of my wife and son." Miller shook his head vigorously. No, it wasn't like that. I discovered something big in the company. Embezzlement, illegal contracts, things that involved the board of directors. I tried to tell you, Mr. Parker, but no one would listen to me." Richard frowned, vaguely remembering the accusations Miller had made before being fired. "What does that have to do with the accident?" Miller took a deep breath before continuing. "I contacted corporate justice. I thought they could help me expose the truth, but things got out of control. They wanted to do more than just reveal information. They wanted to send a message." Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. "Are you saying they—" Miller nodded, tears in his eyes. "They planned the accident, but I swear I didn't know. When I found out, it was already too late. The money was to keep me quiet." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair falling to the floor with a crash. "You kept quiet? You knew the truth all this time and said nothing?" Jack quickly intervened, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Mr. Parker, please, calm down." Miller shrank in his seat, fear evident on his face. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I'm so sorry. I've lived with this guilt for years. That's why I sent you the message. I needed you to know the truth." Richard collapsed back into his chair, feeling all the energy leave him. "Who?" he finally asked. "Who on the board was involved?" Miller pulled an envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. "Here's everything. Names, dates, transactions. Everything you need to expose the truth." Richard looked at the envelope, feeling the weight of its contents. "Why now?" he asked. "Why did you decide to reveal all this now?" Miller lowered his gaze. "Because I'm dying, Mr. Parker. Cancer. I don't have much time left and I needed to do the right thing at least once in my life." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at the envelope, feeling that he had in his hands not only the truth about Emily and Tommy's death, but also the power to dismantle the company he had built over years. "What are you going to do now, Mr. Parker?" Jack asked softly. Richard thought of Matt, of the new life they were building together. He thought of Emily and Tommy, of the justice they deserved. And he thought of all the employees of his company, innocent people who could be affected if everything came to light. With trembling hands, he took the envelope. "I'm going to do the right thing," he said finally. "For my family, for Emily and Tommy's memory, and for all the people who trust me." As they left the cafe, Richard stopped and looked at Miller one last time. "Thank you for the truth, Robert. I hope you find peace." Miller nodded, tears running down his cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mr. Parker, for everything." That night back home, Richard hugged Matt tightly. "Is everything okay, Dad?" the boy asked, feeling the emotion in his father's embrace. Richard smiled, feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. "It will be, Matt. I promise you." While Matt slept, Richard sat in his office, Miller's envelope open in front of him. He made a decision. He would expose the truth, clean up his company, honor Emily and Tommy's memory, but he would do it in a way that wouldn't destroy innocent lives. With determination, he began to write a plan for justice, for redemption, and for a new beginning. What Richard didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a chapter full of challenges, but also of hope and new opportunities. The following months were a whirlwind of activity for Richard and Matt. With the information provided by Miller, Richard initiated a silent but thorough cleanup of his company. Working closely with a team of trusted lawyers and auditors, he began to unravel the web of corruption that had been woven at the highest levels of the company. The process was painful and exhausting. Richard had to confront old friends and colleagues, some of whom turned out to be deeply involved in illegal activities. Each new discovery was like a blow, reminding him how blind he had been to what was happening under his own nose. But in the midst of all the chaos and uncertainty, Richard found an anchor in Matt. The boy, with his innate curiosity and compassionate heart, became a constant source of support and motivation. One night, as they were having dinner together, Matt asked a question that took Richard by surprise. "Dad, do you think Mom Emily would be proud of what you're doing?" Richard was silent for a moment, feeling a lump in his throat. "I hope so, Matt," he finally responded. "Emily always valued honesty and integrity above all else. I think she would want us to do the right thing, no matter how difficult it might be." Matt nodded, thoughtful. "I think she would be proud," he said with conviction. "And Tommy too." Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. He reached out and gently squeezed Matt's hand. "Thank you, son. You don't know how much that means to me." As the investigation progressed, Richard made a crucial decision. Instead of publicly exposing the entire scandal, which could have destroyed the company and endangered the jobs of thousands of innocent people, he opted for a more discreet approach. Working quietly with the authorities, Richard systematically eliminated the corrupt elements from the company. Those directly implicated in illegal activities were turned over to justice, while others were simply removed from their positions. At the same time, Richard implemented a series of internal reforms designed to prevent future abuses. He established an independent ethics committee, strengthened internal audit processes, and created secure channels for employees to report irregularities without fear of retaliation. The process was long and exhausting, but gradually, Richard began to see results. The company started to regain its reputation, and employees, realizing the positive changes, renewed their commitment and loyalty. Meanwhile, the relationship between Richard and Matt continued to strengthen. The boy, impressed by his father's determination, began to show an increasing interest in the workings of the company and in concepts of business ethics. One afternoon, while Richard was reviewing some documents in his home office, Matt entered timidly. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Richard looked up, smiling at his son. "Of course, Matt, what is it?" "I was thinking," the boy began, hesitating a bit. "Do you think someday I could work with you in the company? Help you keep it good?" Richard felt a wave of emotion. The idea that Matt wanted to follow in his footsteps, not for money or power, but out of a desire to do good, filled him with indescribable pride. "Matt," he said, standing up to hug his son, "nothing would make me happier. But remember, you have your whole life ahead of you. You can be whatever you want to be." Matt nodded, but there was determination in his eyes. "I know, Dad, but I want to do something that matters, something that helps people, like you're doing now." That night, as Matt slept, Richard found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed in such a short time. From being a lonely man tormented by loss, he had become a dedicated father and a business leader committed to ethics. But there was still one pending matter, one that Richard had been postponing for months. With a sigh, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized long ago. "Ellen? This is Richard Parker. I think it's time we talk about Matt's future, about his legal adoption." The conversation with Ellen was long and emotional. Although the woman had come to accept that Matt was better off with Richard, the idea of legally giving up her rights as a grandmother was painful. "I understand it's difficult, Ellen," Richard said softly, "but I want Matt to have the security of a permanent home, and I want you to continue being part of his life. I'm not trying to replace you. I just want to give Matt the stability he deserves." Finally, after many tears and promises, Ellen agreed. They agreed to start the adoption process, with the condition that she would maintain regular visitation rights. When Richard gave Matt the news the next day, the boy's reaction took him by surprise. "But Dad," Matt said, frowning, "aren't I already your son? Why do we need a judge to say it?" Richard knelt in front of Matt, taking his hands in his own. "You are my son in all the ways that matter, Matt. This is just to ensure that legally, no one can ever separate us. Do you understand?" Matt nodded slowly, a small smile forming on his lips. "So I'll officially be Matt Parker?" Richard smiled, feeling his heart swell with love. "Yes, son. You'll officially be Matt Parker." The adoption process moved quickly, thanks in part to Richard's contacts and Ellen's cooperation. And so, on a sunny spring morning, Richard and Matt stood before a judge to make official what their hearts already knew. They were father and son. As the judge pronounced the words that legally united them as a family, Richard couldn't help but think of Emily and Tommy. How, in some mysterious way, fate had intertwined their lives with Matt's, bringing light and hope where once there was only darkness. "Congratulations, Matt Parker," the judge said with a smile. "And congratulations to you too, Mr. Parker. You are officially father and son." Matt threw himself into Richard's arms, both with tears of joy in their eyes. "I love you, Dad," Matt whispered. "And I love you, my son," Richard responded, hugging tightly the boy who had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. As they left the courthouse, Richard holding Matt's hand, they realized that this was not an ending but a new beginning. A beginning full of promises, challenges, and above all, love. What they didn't know was that fate still had one last surprise in store for them. A surprise that would test their newly formed family in a way neither of them could have anticipated. The sun rose over the city, bathing the streets in a golden light that seemed to promise a new beginning. In the Parker mansion, Richard woke up early, as had become his habit in recent months. He quietly made his way to Matt's room, smiling as he saw his son sleeping deeply, hugging the teddy bear he had given him on the day of the official adoption. As he prepared breakfast, Richard reflected on the incredible journey the past year had been. The transformation of his company, Matt's adoption, the process of healing and forgiveness he had experienced. It all seemed almost too good to be true. The sound of sleepy footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Matt entered the kitchen, rubbing his eyes and yawning. "Good morning, Dad," he mumbled, sitting at the table. "Good morning, champ," Richard replied, placing a plate of pancakes in front of his son. "Ready for the big day?" Matt nodded, his face lighting up with a smile. Today was the day Richard would officially present the Emily and Tommy Parker Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping children in street situations and promoting business ethics. "Do you think Mom, Emily and Tommy would have liked the idea?" Matt asked, his mouth full of pancakes. Richard felt a pang of emotion in his chest. "I'm sure they would have loved it, Matt. Especially the part where you helped plan it." And it was true. Matt had actively participated in creating the foundation, contributing ideas and perspectives that only a child who had experienced life on the streets could offer. As they were getting ready to leave, Richard's phone rang. It was Ellen. "Good morning, Richard," the woman said, her voice charged with emotion. "I just wanted to wish you good luck today. I'll be watching the presentation on television." "Thank you, Ellen," Richard responded sincerely. "It means a lot to us." The relationship between Richard and Ellen had improved significantly in recent months. Although it had initially been difficult for her to accept the adoption, she had gradually come to see Richard not as a rival, but as an ally in caring for and loving Matt. The Foundation's presentation was a resounding success. Richard, with Matt by his side, spoke passionately about the importance of corporate social responsibility and commitment to the community. "This foundation," Richard said, his voice resonating in the packed auditorium, "is born not only from the pain of a loss, but from the hope of a new beginning. It is born from the belief that every child deserves a chance, and that companies have the power and responsibility to make a positive difference in the world." When Richard finished his speech, the ovation was deafening. But for him, the most significant moment was when Matt approached the microphone. "My dad taught me that we can turn pain into something good," the boy said, his voice trembling slightly from nerves, but firm in his conviction. "I hope this foundation helps many children find a home and a family like I did." There wasn't a dry eye in the room after Matt's words. That night, back at home, Richard and Matt sat in the backyard looking at the stars. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Matt said suddenly, "for everything you've done." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "And I'm proud of you, Matt, more than you can imagine." As the night sky shone above them, Richard reflected on the incredible journey his life had been. He had experienced the deepest loss, but he had also discovered a love and strength he didn't know he possessed. "You know, Matt," he said softly, "sometimes I think Emily and Tommy sent us to each other, so we could heal together." Matt snuggled closer to his father. "I think so too, Dad." At that moment, as if the universe wanted to confirm their words, a shooting star crossed the sky. "Look, Dad," Matt exclaimed, pointing. "Make a wish." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, but when he opened them, he simply smiled and hugged his son. "I don't need to wish for anything, Matt," he said softly. "I already have everything I could wish for right here." And so, under a starry sky, Richard and Matt Parker, father and son united by destiny and love, looked towards the future with hope and determination. They knew there would be challenges ahead, but they also knew that together they could face anything. Richard and Matt's story was not just one of loss and redemption, but one of love, hope, and the incredible capacity of the human heart to heal and grow. It was a testimony to how, even in the darkest moments, light can find its way, bringing with it a new dawn. As the night progressed and the stars shone brightly overhead, father and son sat in silence, grateful for the present and excited for the future that awaited them. A future they would face together as the family they were always meant to be.